Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Moin Robani. Moin, good to see you again.
And good to see you, Nasim. It's always a pleasure.
Yes, we missed you last week, but yeah, let's get cracking. There's a lot has happened over the past 2 weeks.
Yes.
We'll begin with the escalation in the West Bank, Israel's military assault in Jenin refugee camp, and Yoav Gallant's use of genocidal language in describing what's happening in the West Bank. The killing of an American Turkish activist, Aysnur Ezgi Waji. So there's a huge contrast between how the US responded to the American citizens that were killed by Hamas and the American Turkish activist. And we'll also look at, we've not spoken about this, actually, why is there such a long delay in prosecution of Hamas captured by the Israelis on October 7? We've seen the US file a case against Sinwar and many other Palestinian leaders. Then we'll talk a bit about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. And then I wanted to get your thoughts on the coverage by ABC News of 7 October. It's the latest mainstream newspaper to write a report about the Hannibal directive and Israel's killing of its own civilians. There aren't many mainstream newspapers who've done that, and ABC is one of the latest ones to do that. And then we'll finish with a discussion about the control over the Philadelphia corridor. But let's begin, as I said, with the West Bank. We saw over the last 2 or so weeks the largest Israeli assault on the occupied West Bank since the Second Intifada. The city of the refugee camp of Jenin is where a lot of the killing and the destruction has taken place. A few things I wanted to get your comments on. First, remarks by Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant using the same genocidal language to speak about the West Bank, which we've become so familiar to when they speak about Gaza. He referred to the death and destruction as mowing the lawn, which is a familiar term, genocidal familiar term, which is used to describe Israel's assaults on Gaza over the decades. And he said, and I quote, "A moment will come when we pull out the roots." So, response to Gallant and the general escalation in the West Bank.
Well, I think it needs to be seen as you've suggested, Nasim, in a broader context. I think until a few months ago, it would have been possible to view Israeli, let's call them counterinsurgency and pacification campaigns in the West Bank as somehow separate from what we've been seeing in the Gaza Strip for the past year. I would argue that that's no longer the case, that we have to see this really as one integrated campaign, because if you take the genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip, whose purpose, it's increasingly apparent, is to make the Gaza Strip unfit for human habitation, and you pair that with the extraordinary expansion and increase in Israeli violence, whether by the military or its settler auxiliaries, against Palestinian communities in the West Bank. Clear acts, multiple acts of ethnic cleansing, attacks on villages, land confiscations. Again, the same language. These people don't belong here and we have to get rid of them. And now you have these massive incursions now in the northern West Bank, in not only in the Jenin refugee camp, but also in the town of Jenin, in Tulkarem, and its two refugee camps, Nur Shams and Tulkarem, and also in Tubas, and most recently in Nablus, and particularly the Balata refugee camp, the main refugee camp there. And then we've also seen Israeli military activity elsewhere, particularly in Hebron and its surrounding towns and villages. It's quite clear that all these various elements are now part of a unified campaign to crush the Palestinians once and for all, and beyond that, to create living conditions that are no longer sustainable and will leave Palestinians either willing to depart or feeling compelled to depart, or as we're increasingly seeing in both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, forced to depart. And if we look at, for example, in the northern West Bank, it's not only assassination campaigns against militants. It's not only the killings of civilians, but there is the widespread and deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure. There is the denial of medical care, for example, blocking ambulances from attending to the wounded, surrounding hospitals so that they can't be reached, and all the rest of it, plowing up roads and so on. So it's true, what we're seeing in the West Bank remains much less intense than in the Gaza Strip. I mean, we have seen Air Force activity and so on, but it's nothing like the saturation bombing of the Gaza Strip, but it's increasingly echoing it. And we can no longer see this as, for example, a pacification effort in case a war breaks out with Lebanon, for example. It's quite clearly directed against the Palestinians living under Israeli rule as a whole. And that raises another question. What do these people have in mind, for example, for Palestinian communities within Israel, Palestinians who are Israeli citizens? There has been very widespread repression, of people being fired or arrested for social media posts or making statements that would be considered perfectly normal in a normal society. But you also get the sense that there is an effort of deliberate provocation, so that some kind of crisis emerges that will allow Israel and its security forces to act in ways that they are unable to at the present moment.
I mean, you can't ignore the fact that I'm not sure if the Israelis, when they went into Gaza, thought about carrying out similar operations in the West Bank. So within that context, I don't think you can ignore the fact that the ironclad support by the Americans has encouraged the Israelis to not miss an opportunity for another ethnic cleansing. And one of the ways I describe Israel is that they never miss an opportunity to carry out ethnic cleansing if they can. And this is an example of that. And I think the ironclad support of Biden, which he said right from the outset and continued has done so, I think Israel saw that as a green light and as an opportunity to say, okay, let's expand this to the West Bank. But fighting, as you mentioned, has focused on Jenin. So I wanted to get your thoughts on, I mean, why specifically Jenin? What is the profile of Jenin specifically, which has made it a center of Palestinian resistance for decades? I mean, 2002, when there was the Second Intifada, Israel went in and massacred Palestinians in Jenin refugee camp, what was known as the Battle of Jenin. So why is Jenin such a center, hotbed of Palestinian resistance?
Well, you mentioned the Second Intifada, and when the Israelis initially went into the West Bank cities in 2002 rather, in what they called Operation Defensive Shield, they were expecting the fiercest battles not in Jenin, but in Nablus, and particularly in the Qasaba, the old city of Nablus, and in Balata refugee camp. But it emerged that the fiercest resistance to their invasion was actually in Jenin, and specifically in its refugee camp. I think there are several factors at play here. One of which is that it's the town furthest north in the West Bank, and therefore the one that is perhaps least controlled by the Palestinian Authority. And this becomes a particularly relevant factor in recent years, where the Palestinian Authority and its security forces have been working very tightly, hand in glove, with Israel and with the Israeli security forces to basically undermine and neutralize any Palestinian resistance to Israel and its occupation. So So the weakening profile of the Palestinian Authority in Jenin, I think, is a significant factor. A second one is that it's quite close to the Green Line. And this makes, for example, the smuggling of weaponry from within Israel easier than it would be, for example, in a place like Jericho. And I think also that you have quite, some of the most extreme settlers are also to be found in the northern West Bank. That's another factor. Another is that you have, for example, a large number of villages surrounding Jenin, where these groups also have a presence, and they seem to also be better organized in Jenin. And although this is not unique to Jenin, they also seem to have established stronger bonds of coordination among themselves than they have in other places. That's much of what I've told you is speculative, but I do think that the comparatively weak position of the Palestinian Authority in Jenin relative to other locations in the West Bank is a key part of the explanation.
We spoke earlier about Yoav Gallant and the genocidal language he's used to speak about the West Bank. But also, I mean, it's become quite common now with Israelis to openly speak of their genocidal intent towards Palestinians. And there was a famous example of that over the past week. Footage, a clip from a podcast that went viral, clip from two nice Jewish boys. So they were laughing and giggling as they were describing their desire for the extermination of Palestinians in Gaza. I would extend that to the West Bank as well. And then what was interesting for me is after the criticism, universal condemnation, they doubled down by saying, "Hey guys, you're condemning us, but this is the view of Israel," and they shared poll after poll after poll showing that Israelis support their genocidal extermination intent to exterminate Palestinians, and for them that was justification. See, it's not us. Everyone thinks that way.
They thought it was exculpatory.
Yes, it was quite strange. I mean, just what do you think of that?
Well, yes, I mean, I think the podcast should be renamed "Two Genocidal Zionist Maniacs." But quite apart from that, it's the development is interesting. I mean, you have these two characters, open. I wouldn't call it gloating, but demanding genocide and insisting on mass murder and wishing, I think he said, if I could only push a button and make life in the Gaza Strip disappear. And saying so with kind of the same tenor that we're conducting this conversation. And they do that because they are rightly confident that they can get away with it. They know that they are operating in a protective and supportive environment. They know that they can say and do whatever they want, or at least they think they did. And then this, it's apparently not a particularly widely listened to or distributed podcast because it's English language, not Hebrew, and so on. And then people began making the comparison with Radio Rwanda, which played an important role in the 1994 genocide in that country. And others began remarking, that at Nuremberg, it wasn't only the politicians who were sentenced to death and hung by their throats, but there was also Julius Streicher, the famous Nazi propagandist. And so these two advocates of genocide, I guess, were either told or felt that they had to kind of explain themselves to avoid any consequences. And the weirdest thing about this is that in their mea culpa, they doubled down. And I guess the furthest they went is to say everyone does this. We all feel this way, and they felt that was somehow exculpatory. I think it demonstrates how far to the right and how far off the reservation Israeli society as a whole has become, and it's a combination of having an absolutely fanatic government, and a media, that's constantly egging itself on, and the society which has come to view the absolutely abnormal as completely normal and in fact desirable. But I think there's also another, I mean, it's easy to focus only on Israel, but I think we would be wrong to do so, because Israel is not an island that exists in a vacuum. Israelis are always very keenly aware of how the world sees them. And they are, Israeli leaders and the Israeli public in general has always understood that the tolerance of the outside world, and particularly of the West, and specifically of the United States, is absolutely fundamental to what they can and cannot do. And for the past year, they have basically been told by Washington, by London, by Brussels, do as you please, anything goes. If there is going to be a change in our policy, it's going to be more, not less weapons. And just to get back to our previous subject, when you talk about these unprecedented invasions of the northern West Bank, if you look at the American and European reaction, it's all framed within the general paradigm of Israeli self-defense, what is called Israel's right to defend itself. Quite apart that it's being done to enforce an illegal occupation that, according to the International Court of Justice, needs to end as rapidly as possible. Anything Israel does, no matter how many people it murders and so on, or rapes to death or whatever, it's always framed as taking place within Israel's right to self-defense. So the criticism you will hear is, while we unconditionally accept and support Israel's right to defend itself, how it does so is also important. In other words, there may be excesses here or there, but the fundamental tenor of Israeli policy of pursuing the annexation of these territories, of seeking to monopolize the territory within it, and ultimately to get rid of its inhabitants, that is justified by applying the paradigm of a purported Israeli right to self-defense against those that it occupies, and indeed against whom it is now committing genocide. So I don't think we can separate these kinds of incidents, like these two genocidal Zionist maniacs, from the international arena in which they operate, and their correct understanding that they have a loud and clear message from President Biden, from Ursula von der Leyen, from Keir Starmer, across the board: do as you please, we have your back. But having said that, if I can just make one more observation, that despite all that I've just said, they are also hedging their bets. They cannot categorically exclude that a Radio Rwanda day may come, and they want to make sure that they have covered their tracks by giving an explanation of what they said. And rather than saying, no, we absolutely didn't mean what we said, and if you understood it this way, you've completely misunderstood, they basically doubled down, and it's really flabbergasting.
Before we get to our next story, I mean, there is another dimension to this which is worth pointing out. I mean, Elon Musk, who presents himself as the champion of free speech.
Free speech absolute.
Yeah, free speech absolute is what so he says. But I remember at the big around November time, he did say anyone who makes genocidal statements, and he was referring to Palestinian activists saying Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. Those statements on his platform will be banned. Genocidal comments will be banned. but these Israeli guys are doing that on his platform. And he also said, I remember, any any statement that falls foul of the laws of that country will also be banned. So presumably that statement, genocidal statement, does not fall foul of Israeli society, and nor does it fall foul of uh, Musk's sense of what is genocide and what is not. So it's worth pointing that out. That someone of Elon Musk's caliber can feel it's okay to allow this sort of genocidal language to be promoted on his platform, even though he's come out and condemned the Palestinian activists for saying something as simple as, Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. So it's worth pointing that out.
Yes, I mean, I unfortunately can't give credit where it's due because I can't remember who said this, but the statement this individual made about Musk was, well, you can take the boy out of apartheid South Africa, but you can't take apartheid out of the boy. And I think this is his worldview quite clearly. Some people are more equal than others. And it's perfectly legitimate from his point of view to censor speech by people whose skin is somewhat more tinted or of the darker persuasion, let's call it that, and to celebrate or allow at least speech by others. I mean, if I'm on Twitter, and what I've noticed in recent weeks is almost every other tweet that shows up in my timeline is Musk waging war against Brazil, because its court system has forced him to behave, and he's this spoiled, rotten, spoiled billionaire brat who, quite like Israel, can't internalize that there are rules and laws that not only apply to him, but that are being applied to him. And so he's going absolutely berserk by the idea that, he is, that there are governments and states around the world that have the political will to enforce their rules and regulations against someone like him.
So now let's turn to the latest killing, Israeli killing, or murder, I should say, of a American Turkish activist in the West Bank. So this was 26-year-old Aysnur Ezgi, a volunteer with the Anti-Occupation International Solidarity Movement. Your thoughts on that, and particularly given how swift the Americans were in condemning condemning the killing of the American citizen held hostage, and their response to that is nowhere near the same. And for me, I mean, this is one of many Americans that were killed, and the response of the Americans has been less than what you would expect from anyone claiming to protect their citizens. You had Rachel Corrie in 2003. There was a number of American citizens who were killed on the Mavi Marmara. And then the most famous of all is Shireen Abu Akleh. And nothing has been done regarding those American citizens. So, just your thoughts on that and put that into historical context, how American citizens who are killed by Israelis are done with so much impunity that the Americans feel they don't feel that they can actually demand justice for their own citizens when it comes to Israel.
Well, Americans or the U.S. government likes to claim that American justice has a long arm that will pursue you to the ends of the earth if you are guilty of the murder of an American citizen, particularly if it's by a foreign government or a foreign group. And that's certainly the case where Americans are killed by official enemies, such as what appears to have been the killing of 6 Israeli hostages by Hamas in the Gaza Strip last week. As you pointed out, one of them is American, and I don't need to recount the response to that by American leaders, by American media. It was a story that dominated the news cycle for days, demands for accountability, for escalation, further dehumanization of Palestinians as a people, and so on. Not just attacks on Hamas, mind you, but on the entire people. Then this woman is shot dead by a single bullet to the head by presumably an Israeli sniper. And all of a sudden, the long arm of American justice reveals itself to be not more than an amputated stub. You look at the statements of senior American officials, and they speak of the death of this woman as if she, was felled by a piece of furniture during an earthquake, or drowned at sea. You look, for example, at the BBC, and they go out of their way to refer to her as an American woman of Turkish origin. Basically sending a message. She's not one of us. She can safely be her death, as it's always called. When people are killed by Israel, they're not killed; they die. Their deaths are passive, whereas when they're killed by official enemies, their deaths are active and the work of satanic forces. And most telling was a reporter asking Secretary of State Antony Blinken about this, and it's just particularly when you compare them to his other statements, and he talks about this as if it's he talks about this as a tragedy, doesn't demand accountability. It's quite clear that the U.S. intelligence services already have every last detail of exactly what happened and who did it. But he says we're still gathering facts. And I suspect the U.S. government will still be gathering facts 65 years from now. And the proof is, as you noted, is in the cases of previous Americans who have been killed by Israel, Rachel Corrie, Shireen Abu Akleh, and others. To the best of my knowledge, the U.S. is still not investigating while claiming to be investigating these deaths. And then the way this is usually done is the investigation is farmed out to the Israelis to exonerate themselves, and then the U.S. graciously accepts that there was nothing amiss. So, this idea that the U.S. Somehow will leave no stone unturned in pursuing justice for U.S. citizens killed abroad, well, it very much depends on who commits the murder. In some cases, it's no big deal. Life goes on, and the U.S. simply looks the other way, and that's also why this young woman's parents have demanded an independent investigation. In other words, an investigation that will determine facts rather than simply engage in a whitewash.
And one of the ways the Americans responded was to file charges against senior Hamas officials, Sinwar and others. So that, raised a number of questions. If the Americans can file charges against Yahya Sinwar and other Palestinian Hamas leaders, why hasn't the Israelis charged suspected perpetrators of October 7 alleged atrocities? So, Haaretz asked that question, and one of the reasons that was cited was the fact that there is insufficient evidence to link specific individuals to the crimes. So there are, of course, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who are in Israeli jails because of their alleged connection with what happened October 7. But as I said, nothing has happened to them. There's no charges against them. So are you surprised by how long it's taking? Given the Americans have already filed charges against Sinwar and others, are you surprised by how long it's taking Israel to prosecute the alleged perpetrators, given how quickly the US has been able to, file charges against Hamas leaders?
Well, let me start by saying that the U.S. indictments filed against the Hamas leaders, this is pure political theater. Um, According to press reports, the U.S. Had plans, I think, to kidnap the Hamas leader, Ismail Haniyeh, and bring him to the U.S. For a trial, but that didn't go through after Israel assassinated him. I'm sure with full knowledge of the U.S. But if you read the indictment, it's really a piece of political theater. Again, particularly when you compare it by the U.S.'s insistence on doing absolutely nothing to indict those responsible for the murder of U.S. citizens by Israel. We can't forget that it's the height of the U.S. election season and so on. So that would be my first observation. The second point is there, as far as Israeli indictments is concerned, I can't imagine that that Israel does not have sufficient evidence to tie, for example, Mohammed Deif, who's the military leader of Hamas, or Yahya Sinwar, who was the leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, to the attacks of October 7th. I mean, if you and I know that he was ultimately responsible for these attacks, it's inconceivable that Israel is still trying to figure out whether he was or was not involved. The reason that there aren't any indictments is usually when you indict someone, it's an indication that you want to arrest them and put them on trial. You don't indict someone who you intend to kill. There's little point in that. And it was telling in this respect. I recently read an interview. I believe it was with someone who was a former chief of staff or officer in charge of Southern Command of the Israeli military during the First Intifada, a retired general by the name of Matan Vilnai. And he says that at one point, either he was given or he decided on a list of 7 names that needed to be killed. And he managed to kill 6 of them. And the 7th who got away was Yahya Sinwar or Mohammed Deif, I can't remember. And remember, we're talking about the First Intifada. This is not October 7th. This was not, the armed uprising that was a second Intifada. We're talking about the First Intifada, where we already know that Israel was operating death squads. And now, Vilnai confirms that there was a list of people whom Israel had determined it was not going to seek to arrest, certainly not indict and put on trial, but was determined to kill. And I think that's what's playing here, is that all these leaders that under normal circumstances you would expect a state engaged in counterinsurgency to seek their arrest, put them on trial, convict them, and so on. None of that is on. None of that is going to happen here. Israel has a kill list, and Israel has already killed tens of thousands. So it's certainly not going to go through the trouble of a trial for these individuals.
Let's turn our attention to Gaza itself. Since our last conversation, there's been a spread of infectious disease as a result of food shortage, which we'll speak about later on. And what I wanted to ask you initially is the appointment by Israel of a chief Gaza officer. That's the actual title itself, I think, of this new role. He will be responsible for apparently food, fuel, and everything, and everyday life infrastructure, in the Gaza Strip. So does that suggest that, Israel is viewing this as a permanent reality, or is it a step towards permanent occupation, or simply a move to manage this disaster?
Well, it's difficult to answer that question because different Israeli leaders are saying different things, and we're seeing now maps being produced, different proposals being floated. Um, uh, what appears to be the case is that Israel is determined to compartmentalize the Gaza Strip into a northern sector that, according to press reports, it intends to basically issue expulsion orders from, and anyone who does not evacuate will be considered a legitimate military target, man, woman, and child, and marked for killing. And in the southern Gaza Strip, the population will be concentrated between what is known as a Netzarim corridor, which leads from the boundary with Israel to the Mediterranean Sea, the buffer zone on the eastern sector of the Gaza Strip along the Israeli boundary, and then the border zone between the Gaza Strip and Egypt, which Israelis call the Philadelphia Corridor, which it also intends to permanently occupy. And it's basically appointing a camp commander, if you will, to not so much to attend to the humanitarian needs of this population, but essentially to ensure that there is no proper supply and distribution of humanitarian needs to the population. That, you know, there is no longer any justification for not calling this a concentration camp. And if it goes on for much longer, there will no longer be any justification for not calling it an annihilation camp or an extermination camp. That's what's happening here. Now, the question becomes that this is tied up with larger dynamics, both in the Gaza Strip and in the region. If these are indeed Israel's plans to have a permanent or at least long-term presence within the Gaza Strip and to impose its full control over the Gaza Strip, will Israel be able to sustain this presence? Will Israel be able to do so under circumstances where there will be a war of attrition against it within the Gaza Strip, and therefore also a war of attrition against it in coming from Lebanon and perhaps other conflicts as well. So I think we also have to separate between Israeli plans, Israeli aspirations, and Israeli realities. I don't think that there is going to be any kind of ceasefire agreement anytime soon that also will lead to the full withdrawal of Israeli forces. It's, you know, there's a ceasefire process, but its purpose is not to achieve a ceasefire. So again, time will tell to which extent Israel is able to sustain a indefinite presence within the Gaza Strip, particularly one as intensive as some of these reports are suggesting.
I was going to leave this question to the end, but because you mentioned the Philadelphia corridor and Netzarim corridor and the ceasefire, I think, you know, it's best us address this right now, which is Netanyahu's insistence on holding on to the Philadelphia corridor. His insistence is the main reason cited for why these ceasefire talks has been torpedoed, but he seems to be alone in that. Even Yoav Gallant, Israel defense minister, he said it was shameful that Netanyahu is prioritizing Israel's controlling the Philadelphia corridor over the hostages. An American official was cited in Harrods saying that the Americans can guarantee Israel's security in the Philadelphia corridor. But not only that, an Israeli army report last week suggested that there are no operational underground tunnel under the Philadelphia corridor. So, and I quote, "No single open tunnel has been found in the Egyptian territory. No single usable tunnel has been discovered under the Philadelphia corridor." And that's a quote from Alon Ben David from the Israeli Channel 13. So why is this Netanyahu so insistent on holding on to this, given that there is no operational tunnel, given how much opposition there is, and also the Americans saying, if you're so worried about this, you know, we can find other alternatives to Israel's security on the Philadelphia corridor?
Well, I would start by pointing out that one thing we should have learned on October 7th is that what Israel does not find does not necessarily not exist. Regarding these tunnels that run under the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt, there were very, very many tunnels that served multiple purposes. Some of them were for importing basic goods, including livestock and consumer items and items for trade and so on, given the Egyptian-Israeli blockade of the Gaza Strip. And some of them were, of course, there for military purposes. And it's widely believed that, for example, in the period between 2011 and 2013, after the Libyan government was overthrown, and at a time when Mohammed Morsi was in power in Egypt, that there was also substantial smuggling of weaponry from Libyan arsenals through the Sinai Peninsula into the Gaza Strip. And there have also been reports of weapons having come in from Iran and or Hezbollah at the time via Sudan, then Egypt, then the Sinai Peninsula. What changed after 2013 is that leadership came to power in Egypt, which was not only very hostile to Hamas, which it viewed as part of the Muslim Brotherhood that it had just overthrown in Cairo, but was also fighting an insurgency in the Sinai Peninsula and was also seeking direct Israeli assistance in fighting this insurgency. And there have been multiple reports, for example, of the Israeli Air Force conducting raids against insurgents in the Sinai Peninsula at the request of and on behalf of the Egyptian military. But so one thing that the Egyptian military did is it razed to the ground basically every last structure on the Egyptian side of the border with the Gaza Strip, which meant that any tunnels that now ran under that border would have to extend much longer because you can't simply, emerge in the middle of a desert and expect to be camouflaged. Then the Egyptians flooded all the tunnels that they could find with seawater, causing them to collapse. And the general belief is that certainly all commercial tunnels have been destroyed, including those that were used by individuals, civilians, including to get into and out of the Gaza Strip. So those tunnels have all been destroyed. It's believed that most military tunnels have been destroyed, but of course, we can't exclude the possibility that there may still be military tunnels under that border. I certainly wouldn't go so far as to state definitively that there are none left, but I would also say that Israel, that there is. I don't think there's anything the Israelis can do that the Egyptians haven't already done. And so the permanent a Israeli presence on this border zone is not really going to change anything. As everyone who has looked at this, with the exception of Antony Blinken, has said, the reason that Netanyahu insists on remaining in this border zone is because he knows it is a condition that the Palestinians will never accept. You either have an indefinite Israeli presence on this border zone, or you have a ceasefire agreement and exchange of captives. And if you don't want a ceasefire agreement and an exchange of captives, well, the best way to do that is to insist on an indefinite presence at this border zone, because that, by definition, makes any agreement impossible. And just one last point, what also Israeli officials and analysts have said, well, if this area is of such vital and crucial importance to Israel's campaign against Hamas, how come Israel didn't even make an effort to seize it until I believe it was May of this year? Almost 7 months after the war erupted in October.
Before we get to the final question, I just want to ask you about two new developments related to Gaza. First is the UN independent investigator on the right to food, Michael Fakhri. He accused Israel of, and I quote, executing a starvation campaign against Palestinians in Gaza. And he said that by December, Palestinians in Gaza made up 80% of the people in the world experiencing famine or catastrophic hunger. That's what Fakhri said. And he went on to say that never in post-war history had a population been made to go hungry so quickly and so completely as was the case for 2.3 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And the second issue related to Gaza is the coverage by ABC News. That's the latest mainstream news agency, which published a story, which we've been speaking about, and many other alternative news agencies have been talking about, which is that Israel used the Hannibal Directive during October 7 attack, meaning that Israeli forces ordered their soldiers to kill their own citizens. So these are the two stories which are, I would say, key developments from the Gaza Strip, and I just want to see, what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. Well, first, let's discuss the quite telling report by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Michael Fakhri. I think, the figures he gave for December will now have changed somewhat, given that there is growing hunger in Sudan. But that doesn't really affect his other main conclusion, which I think is a more important one, that never since 1945 has starvation taken root so rapidly and so widely within a captive population as in the Gaza Strip. And this really puts the lie to all the Israeli officials and apologists and flunkies who have basically been saying, famine, what famine? They've never had it so good. We're ensuring the delivery of thousands of filet mignon to Gaza on a daily basis. So I think, facts are facts, and one need only look at the figures, as Michael Fakhri has done, to reach the conclusions that he has. Of course, it's more important that he, as a recognized specialist in this field, reaches these conclusions. But I think, they're really indisputable. And it speaks so much not only about Israel and its policies, but against Israel's enablers. Every time you hear U.S. officials saying it's vitally important to achieve a ceasefire agreement so that humanitarian aid can begin flowing into the Gaza Strip, what that means is that they have signed on to a policy that deliberately withholds humanitarian aid from the civilian population of the Gaza Strip unless and until Hamas capitulates to the U.S.-Israeli conditions for a ceasefire agreement. And that's because we know perfectly well that it would take literally no more than a single phone call from the White House to the Israeli Prime Minister's office to ensure that humanitarian aid, life-saving humanitarian aid, begins flowing into the Gaza Strip at proper volumes. And we, in fact, have proof of this. After Israel killed 7 staff members of World Central Kitchen, the organization run by one of Biden's favorite chefs, Jose Andres, the U.S. expressed its displeasure to Israel. And for several weeks thereafter, the level of humanitarian aid that flowed into the Gaza Strip rose dramatically. Once that was behind us, it went back to even lower levels. And so what this means is that it is not only Israel, but also the U.S. and Israel's other allies who have real influence over it that are complicit in a policy of deliberately withholding humanitarian aid to a captive civilian population in order to force political concessions from a movement of which they are not members. And sorry, I forgot the other. Oh, the other report. Yeah, that's by ABC Australia, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
And this concerns an investigation relying primarily on Israeli sources about how Israel responded on October 7th. And central to the story is the Hannibal Directive or Hannibal Doctrine, which is basically as it's put, an illegal and immoral Israeli policy, which says that a dead Israeli soldier is better than an Israeli prisoner of war, and that Israel will shoot and bomb to kill any group that is holding a soldier captive, including that soldier, to ensure or to seek to ensure that that soldier then can no longer be used to negotiate an exchange of prisoners. That's where the Hannibal Directive originates, and it was formulated specifically to ensure that there are no living Israeli prisoners of war. What changed on October 7th is that it was also applied to Israeli civilians, because, of course, Hamas on that day not only attacked Israeli military bases, but also a number of Israeli population centers, and both Hamas and other groups kidnapped a number of civilians and abducted a number of civilians and took them hostage in the Gaza Strip. Now, we've known already that there were incidents in which Israeli military forces knowingly opened fire on Israeli civilians. There was a well-known case of a tank that launched a artillery shell against a house, I believe it was in Kibbutz Be'eri, knowing there were not only Hamas militants, but also Israeli civilian hostages inside, and killed 12 or 13 of them. We've seen pictures of cars that were shot up by Israeli Apache helicopters. What's significant about this latest report is it demonstrates the very extensive and really terrifying scale of the application of the Hannibal Directive on October 7th. The helicopter pilots, I believe, said, there were, I can't remember how many helicopters were committed to the air on that day, and they basically went through their entire supply of bullets. Now, we know that approximately 1,150 Israelis were killed on that day. According to the figures we have available to us from Israeli sources, I believe approximately 700 of them were classified as civilians. Now, what this new report calls into question is, was it really the case that Hamas, which we do know, by the way, committed a number of atrocities on that day, but was it really the case that they killed twice as many civilians as military personnel? Or was it the case that perhaps a very substantial number of of those who were classified as civilians on October 7th were killed not by Hamas, but by the Israeli military in pursuance of the Hannibal Directive? So again, these are issues on which the Israelis will not engage, and will certainly not give clear and compelling answers. But I think it raises a fundamental question, yet once again, about the Israeli narrative on regarding October 7th. We already know there was no mass rape. That was a hoax. We already know there were no beheaded babies. That was a hoax. We already know that no babies were roasted in ovens. That was a hoax. We already know there were no infants hung to death on clotheslines. That was a hoax. And now this idea that October 7th was really one big atrocity against civilians. Well, that may well be true, but one for which Israel may well have been at least as responsible as Palestinians. And again, this is important because there was a very clear military dimension to October 7th. And the way Israel and its apologists have been presenting this is almost as if not a single Israeli soldier was involved on that day, that it was purely, a World War II type attempt to exterminate Israeli Jews. We now know the picture is very much more complicated than that which has been presented to us now for almost an entire year.
I think it's very difficult for the mainstream media now and Israel to ignore that there is an alternative narrative and more evidence is coming out. Yeah. But that needs to be understood within the context that Israel is allegedly on a campaign to destroy vital evidence from 7 October. And this is from Israeli sources. So there was a headline last week on an Israeli newspaper, and the headline said, "The IDF dismantles Nahan Oz outpost. How will it be possible to investigate in depth what happened there?" So that's not the first time Israel covered up evidence, but there seems to be concerted effort, and there's questions within Israel itself of how Israel is doing that. There's concerns around that. Of course, mainstream media in the West is not even touching this issue because they're fearful of allegations of anti-Semitism. But Israeli newspapers seem to be way more courageous in wanting to look into this. So yeah, I thought I'd add that to what you mentioned, and maybe this story will continue, and we can come back to that later on, of how Israel is destroying evidence of what happened on October 7th. I wanted to end our conversation with an article that was published in Harris last week by retired Major General Yitzhak Brick. The headline was, "If we continue fighting in Gaza by raiding and rebuild." So he said in the article, "If we continue fighting in Gaza by raiding and re-raiding the same targets, not only won't we bring Hamas to collapse, but will collapse," meaning Israel, "ourselves." So Israel failing to achieve its objectives, losing the genocidal campaign, and becoming a pariah is a theme we've covered many times. Chuck Schumer, the leading Democrat, he once said that Israel cannot survive if it becomes a pariah. I mean, I think we're way past Israel being a pariah. So your response just to what Brick said, and there's the growing realization that Israel is not going to achieve its aim.
Well, I think this gets back to an issue we've discussed on several occasions previously, which is that Israel's military is not only a conventional army that by its nature seeks a quick and decisive outcome for in any armed conflict, but Israel is also a fairly small society that relies on overwhelming superior force, overwhelming technological superiority, and so on, to fight wars with and extraordinary violence, I should add, as we've seen the Gaza Strip, because it seeks to fight wars quickly, decisively on foreign territories, and that military doctrine has completely disintegrated in the past year. And I think one point that Brick is raising is that Israel is not capable of successfully waging prolonged wars of attrition, yet that is precisely what it is doing. And the other point he's making is that there is as a result of this form of conflict, there is now growing polarization within Israeli society, between, let's say, the general population that is conscripted and serves, and those sections of its, what are called the Haredi, the Orthodox Jewish population, that have been exempt from service, and whose exemption from service is becoming an increasing issue, given that other Israelis are having to repeatedly perform reserve tours of duty. And he talks about the economic costs of Israel, not only in terms of how much waging war and genocide is actually costing it, but in terms of the opportunity costs, lost investments, and so on. And so basically what he's saying is that if Israel insists on continuing with this war, it's not Hamas that's going to collapse first. And he also, I should add, raises one other fundamental point, if I remember that article correctly, which is that, let's say, the social contract, for lack of a better term, that Israelis have with their government is that their government provides them security, and that if it fails to secure them, it will stop at nothing to retrieve them. Well, the confidence of the Israeli public in the invincibility of their armed forces, of course, disintegrated and evaporated on October 7th. But now you also have a situation where very many Israelis feel not only that the Israeli government is placing the genocidal camp, prioritizing the genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip over a deal to retrieve its captives and hostages through an agreement, but just as importantly, that it's doing so not for reasons that could be justified in terms of a proper strategy for ensuring Israel's security or victory or whatever you want to call it, but that this approach is being followed for quite narrow, self-serving political reasons. In other words, to keep the current Israeli governing coalition from collapsing, to ensure that the Israeli leaders responsible for October 7th don't have to face the consequences, and so on. And so it's this combination of it's this combination of really a stab in the heart of confidence in their own leadership and their own military, combined with the idea that people are being sacrificed for a political agenda that primarily concerns the narrow interests of those driving it, that has led Ishaq Break to make these comments.
Your point about social contract, sparked two things in my mind. First is just the general migration of Jews from Israel. Of course, Israel was founded on the idea that it is the haven for Jews, but many Jews now, I think people concede that Israel is actually the most unsafe place for Jews. And if you look at the figures, since October 7, 42,185 Israelis left the country. Maybe the numbers are higher. And the numbers coming in are half that. So that's completely debunking the Israeli social contract, or undermining the contract that Israel is a safe haven for Jews. Another thing that came to mind is what you asked the question: if there's a growing consensus that Israel is losing the war, why does Netanyahu persist? Of course, the one argument is that it's to save his political career, and the other is, it takes me back to a video we all know of Netanyahu from many years back, where he said that America, no matter what, will always support Israel. And I think on top of that, I think he knows global Zionism will kick into gear. They will find a way to somehow rescue Israel from whatever hole Netanyahu pushes the country into. That's just an observation, and maybe you want to comment on that. If not, we can end the conversation.
Well, I would just make the following comment that in addition to Netanyahu's confidence that Washington has his back, I think there's something particular about this U.S. administration that Netanyahu may well believe that regardless of the traditional unconditional U.S. support of Israel, and one that I remain convinced is done primarily out of a U.S. conviction that it is serving U.S. interests, that there is something particular about this administration, above and beyond its predecessors, that has led Netanyahu and his cohorts to conclude that there literally are no red lines and no limits. And this, in turn, may have given him the belief that before Biden leaves office in January, he may yet succeed in provoking a direct military confrontation between the United States and Iran.
Thanks, Moin. So that was my guest, Moin Rabbani, and that wraps up our this week's edition of Weekly Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Moin Rabbani. And thank you, Moin, and thank you for tuning in. See you next week for another episode of Memo Review with me, Nasim Ahmed. Bye-bye.